Today, at your request, I'll be showing you how I made this sketchbook. It's a hardcover book with an open binding so that it lays flat when I'm drawing or painting. I'll show you a few of my other handmade books and the books where I learned most of my techniques. I'll then lead you through the process of stitching it all together, adding the covers, and decorating them with your own eraser prints. And by the end of this video, you'll know everything that you need to make your own custom sketchbooks. I recently got this new art wrap from Peg&Awl, and one of the great features about it is that on the back, it has two very deep pockets that go all the way down to the bottom of the wrap. And so my goal was to make a custom watercolor sketchbook that would be the perfect size to fit inside one of these pockets. These are the items that you'll need for making today's sketchbook. I have 2 sheets of bookboard. Bookboard is like a cardboard, but it's thicker and it doesn't bend as much. But if you don't have access to this, you can use a thicker cardboard. You also want to have some type of paper. I would recommend using a drawing paper or a watercolor paper, depending on what your purpose is going to be for the sketchbook. For mine, I used a sample of different watercolor papers. For sewing the signatures, you want to have some type of thread. I'm using a linen thread, but I've had good luck with any type of thicker string. And then you want a candle for waxing the string or some other piece of wax. I'll be using a curved needle, but if you don't have that and all you have is a normal sewing needle, that's fine as well. For poking the holes in the signatures, I'll be using a thumbtack and an awl. If you don't have an awl, you can also just use a thicker needle for widening the holes. I'll also be using something called a bone folder for folding the edges of the paper. These used to be made of bone, although these days they're mostly just made of plastic. I also have an assortment of clips for clipping everything to dry and some neutral pH adhesive. But if you don't have an archival glue, Elmer's or any kind of craft glue will work just fine, and then a brush to apply that. And then the optional supplies that you don't need, but that's handy, is some type of nonstick baking paper or waxed paper. So let's get started. The version that I'm going to make today is one that I saw on the Peg&Awl website, and I'll link that in the description if you're interested. She has a fantastic tutorial there. When I learned to make books back in the 1990s, I used these 2 books largely. I also had a friend who made wonderful books, and she wanted to learn how to crochet, and I wanted to learn how to make books, so we did a trade. But other than that, I learned almost everything that I know about making books from these 2 books. This was the first one. It was made in 1963, and all of the techniques in here are really formal and very traditional. It tells you about all the special tools. It goes into detail about all of the different techniques you can use. In general, there are 4 different types of bindings. One type is an accordion binding. There's a front cover and a back cover, but the binding is open, and all of the pages are either cut or glued together so that they open up like an accordion. So when you open it up, it's like this, and you can do a long spread that way. I remember this book came out, I think, in the early 90s, and it was really exciting to me at the time because it had lots of beautiful journals and books, and these were true artist books. It was such a delight to be able to look at here and see all the different bindings and see all of the different projects that people made with it. I don't even know if this book is still in print, but this was the one that really got me excited about bookmaking and all of its possibilities. The other 3 types of bindings can be shown here. One is called a pamphlet stitch, where you basically have a group of paper that you fold. If you look at the top, you can see that there are 2 different groups of folded paper, and they're stitched together. You can see the stitching here on the inside, and here you can see how it's 2 different groups of folded paper that are stitched together. It's very common to make pamphlet stitch books with just one little pamphlet, but for this one, I added a second one to it. And it's very lightweight and usually soft covered. The next is called a Codex or a Western Codex binding, and this is the more formal type of binding that you see in hardcover books. And normally they look something like this, minus the beads. They have a closed binding, and they have a hard cover in the front and the back, and then they have little folded sections of paper called signatures that are sewn together and attached. And this is just a little one that I made years ago. And I used to really love to make open binding ones where I didn't cover at the end. I liked where the stitching showed. And so these are a few different examples of that. And these are more complicated to make, but really lovely, and they wear really well. And then the other type is a Japanese binding, or sometimes they're called a stab binding. And this is where the stitching is on the outside. And sometimes you have a hard cover on the back and a soft cover on the front. And sometimes you have soft on the front and the back. This is one of the oldest ones that I made. And this was great because it was really inexpensive material, and it was a great little journal for recording ideas and just recording little art things. But for today's sketchbook, I want something that's going to lay flat. So that rules out the Japanese binding. And I want something that's going to be secure enough in the pencil wrap, and also secure enough to be able to open it and use it without being floppy. So that leaves out a pamphlet stitch. And so I'm left with the Western Codex binding. And so I'm going to do a modified version of this that's going to be more like this, although I'm going to use tapes to make the binding a little bit more secure. And I'll show you how I'm going to do that now. A quick little anatomy lesson about Western Codex books. Each single folded sheet of paper is called a folio, and you can take several different folios and put them all together, and when they're put together like that, it's called a signature. I only have 2 sheets here, but it's quite common to have several sheets. And then you take several different signatures and you put them together, and then you stitch them up and you connect them together. You have a front cover and a back cover and some type of spine to give it stability. I have this sample set of watercolor paper that I got at Cass Art. It came with 10 sheets and I have about 8 left. You can see the different papers that are in there. And I thought this would be fun to make a sketchbook where I could not only do sketches, but explore different papers. I think I've used both of the Bockingford sheets. So I have 2 of the Arches, 2 of the Saunders Waterford, 2 of the Langton, and 2 of the Cass Art. The fun thing about these papers is they're stamped on the back so you can see which ones you're using. So I'm going to divide them into different signatures or groups of folded papers. I'll have 1 signature of the Waterford, 1 signature of the Arches, 1 signature of the De La Rowney Langton, and then 1 signature of the Cass Art watercolor paper. And because I'll be stitching on the outside, I'm going to take each section of 2 and fold them in half, and then the stitching will be in the center. I'll be using a bone folder to help the creases be a little more secure. So I'm taking the 2 sheets, and I want them to be so that when it's open, the writing is on the left-hand side because I'm right-handed and I generally will paint or draw on the right side of a sketchbook. I'm going to fold them one at a time because some of these papers are quite thick. And you can see how that binding is really bumpy, so the bone folder is going to help flatten that, make that a little bit nicer and make it lay better. So there you go. I'll have the little inside of the booklet right there. And this size will fit perfectly inside that outside pocket of the pencil wrap. And I've cut a few bookbinding boards that are exactly the same size. And so this one will be the back and this one will be the front. And then the binding on the side will be open. So I'm going to fast forward while I fold the rest of these, and then we'll be back. I folded them all up, and each little signature has 2 sheets of paper, and when they're folded in half, I have 8 different sheets that I could paint on. And again, I've divided them by the type. So this little signature is the Daler Rowney, and then the Waterford, and the Arches, and the Cass Art. And then the front and back covers are cut exactly to the same size. Traditionally, book covers are a little bit larger, but I like mine to be the same size. And that gives me a decent sized sketchbook. I don't think it's too big for the pencil case, and it won't be too heavy either. So I'm going to get started with sewing it now. I've made a little template for myself of where I'm going to poke the holes. It doesn't really matter where you place them. This is just where I've decided I'd like them for here. I'm starting with the first hole 1.5 centimeters from the bottom, and then I'm moving over 1.5 centimeters to the 3 centimeter point for my second hole, and then 5 centimeters, 6.5, 8.5, 10, 12, and 13.5. And so in total, I have 8 different holes, and this is going to be my template. I'm just going to use a push pin and push through in each of those spots. And then I'll use this to place the holes in each of these other signatures. And I'll make sure when I'm finished that they stay in the same direction that I'm punching the holes in, so that it doesn't get confusing. Because this paper is quite thick, I'm going to punch the holes in each one individually, and then I'll put the papers in each signature together and punch the holes again. There are a lot of different ways that you can punch the holes, but this is one that I find really easy for a more simple sketchbook like this one. If I was making a sketchbook with thinner paper, I would generally clip those pages together and do the holes all in one go. And for that, I would recommend opening up the signature and placing it on top of a piece of perforated cardboard or something that would be able to easily be permeated by the needle. I'm giving you the whole process here for those who are interested, but I've also included timestamps in the video, so if you'd like to skip ahead to the next stage, you can do that quite easily. Making a same-sized sheet to use as a template, I think, is the best way to be able to make sure that the holes are all going to line up with one another on each signature. And that's going to mean that your stitching is going to be a bit tighter and your book will be more successful. It's been a long time since I've made a book, and I've forgotten how much I really enjoy this process. It's quite meditative. And there's something about making something on your own that makes it a little bit more precious. And not just because you can choose your own paper and materials. When I used to teach in schools, it didn't matter what my subject matter was, whether I was teaching English or art. I always had my students make their own sketchbook or journal on the first day of class. And then they'd continue to use that throughout the course of the year. And I think there's something about going through the process of making your own book that makes you value it just that little bit more. And then the things that you put into it have a little bit of extra magic to them. So I highly recommend finding some paper that you like and making a sketchbook of your own. It's not going to be as perfect as one of the ones that you can buy, but it is going to be all yours. And there's something pretty special about that. I've punched all my holes, and when they're all together, you can see them here. And now I want to widen them just a little bit before I add the string. For that, I think I'm going to use my awl. So I'll open each signature and poke through the holes with this just to widen them a little bit and make sure they have enough room for all the string and the needle. All right, now I'm ready to sew, but first I have to cut some tapes. So I'm going to cut a few thin strips of fabric to put into each of these sections. So I'll have one there, and one there. There's no hard and fast rule about how many holes you should have in the binding. I've measured this amount because I knew that I wanted to have 3 tapes, and I knew that I wanted each tape to be 2 centimeters wide. And each of these tapes needs to wind around the front of the book and around the back of the book. So I've decided on a length that seems good to me and taken some old material that I had and cut 3 different tapes to that size. You can make the holes as close together or as far apart as you like. That's the really exciting thing about bookmaking. You're the designer. In general, I've found if you want to do the tapes and if you want to have an odd number of tapes, then you want to have an even number of holes and vice versa. And when they're sewn, on the outside, it's going to look something like this. And I'll be using some linen thread. It's unwaxed, and so I'm going to wax this by myself. And I do that usually just with a candle. I'll show you. And I'll be using this curved needle, which I think is a little bit easier. You want to measure enough thread so that you don't run out in the middle of sewing the signatures together. And the recipe that I always use is to start with a generous tail and then measure the length of the spine of the book for each signature. So because I have 4 signatures, I want to make sure that I have enough thread to span the length of each signature and then have a generous tail at the beginning and a generous tail at the end. And this is how I like to wax my thread. I just take a candle, you can see this one's been used lots, and I put my thread against it and put my thumb there and pull it through. And I just do that a few times. And that's it. And the reason that you wax it is because it makes the thread a little bit stronger so that it's less likely to break or tear. Then thread the needle. And I leave a good amount of tail. I don't make a knot. Some people do, but I don't. And so we'll start with the first signature. The way that you sew the signatures is in reverse order. So the first one that you sew is going to end up being on the bottom of the book. And that's a good thing to keep in mind if you're planning pages strategically. And the first signature is the easiest one to sew. I'll be sewing from right to left, but if you're left-handed, you can sew from left to right. There's no one perfect way to do this. So I've started by putting my needle into the first hole from the outside of the spine onto the inside, and then going through the hole next to that from the inside to the outside. And now I want to add my first strip of material. And I'll lay that strip of material between the next 2 holes, and then guide the thread over that and into the 3rd hole. The pattern is quite simple here. You're just going in and out and in and out. So where you have spaces on the inside, there will be thread on the outside and vice versa. And so in the areas where you have the stitching on the outside of the spine, I'll be laying down these strips of material and that thread will go over the material. And I'm just going up and down through the holes, and I'm placing these pieces of fabric in every other section. You can see they just get sewn over. You can see when it's done how the first signature looks. On the inside, you have this stitching, and then on the outside, you have the stitching with these 3 pieces of fabric. And this is the end, and this is where we're still attached to the needle. And this is the time at the end of each signature that you want to make sure everything is pulled taut. So make sure there are no knots and everything is pulled evenly. And now before we add the second signature, I'm going to take these flaps and pull them over. and make sure that it's in the correct direction. And now we're going to go into the hole that's right next to it. And so you always want to go into the hole that's closest to the one where your thread is. So we'll go in there. And then down to the next hole and out. And this is where this little piece of fabric is going to help us. So we make sure that's folded. Keep it pretty taut, as taut as you can. And before we go into this next hole, we're just going to loop through here, and that's going to help us be connected to that first signature. And then we go through this hole. And then we do that same process for the next 2 tapes. Before I go through the last hole, I like to make sure that everything is pulled pretty tightly. For now, we're going to leave this because we'll come back when it's all finished and we'll do a little knot stitch through the next 2 signatures. So we just want to leave that. And this is what it looks like on the outside. And then everything is secure on the inside and pulled tightly. And I also want to make sure that these, do you see that gap there? I don't want that gap to be quite as big. So I want to make sure that this first stitch and this last one are as close as possible. So I'll open it up and just lightly pull like this. So then I'll take my next one, add that, and I'm going to do the same thing again. And I've added a few clips on the bottom just to hold everything together. It makes it a little bit easier on your hands. And then I'm going to add the next signature in the same way. Only this time, I'm going to not go through the middle or the whole thing. I'm going to go through this bottom section that's closest to the next hole in the same direction that I'm sewing. And I'll do that for the other ones as well. Again, the string that's closest to the next hole that I'm going to put my needle through in the same direction, I'll loop it through. So underneath where the crisscross is there. And make sure you don't go through your fabric. You just want to go through the string. And now that I'm at the end, I need to connect it to the signature that's next to it, which is the second signature. And so I'm going to make a kettle stitch for that. And that is simply taking my needle and going through that stitch. This is where the curved needle comes in handy, although it's not necessary. You can do this whole thing with a straight needle and pull it through. And before I pull it all the way through, you can see there's this loop, and I'm just going to put the needle through that loop, and that knots it. Now we're ready to go and add the next signature. Before you do that, make sure that you pull all of the thread tightly. And then I can clip that. And now I'm going to add my final signature. And before I sew that, I'm also going to clip this bottom part to the rest. Just makes my life a little bit easier when I'm fiddling around. Okay, so same process. Go through that first hole. So just go through, back, through that loop. And I'll actually do this a few times because this is the last thread. And then I'll trim that. I'll put a bit of glue on it later. I'm going to leave a little bit of a tail for now. And then for this one, this first one, remember, isn't attached. So I'm going to carefully open that first signature. And because that wasn't tied off here, it's probably a little bit looser. So I'm going to gently pull it and make sure it's tight enough. And now I'm going to thread the needle and make a kettle stitch attaching that to the signature that's next to it. And I'll make 2 of those just to give it some extra stability. So go through. And do that twice. And that's it. And I'll trim that. And here's how it looks on the outside. And so we have our little booklet, our little sketchbook, and it'll lay flat now when I want to paint. This is just a functional sketchbook for me. I don't need it to be a perfect binding. So now I'm going to take some glue and glue this down, glue these tapes down over the pages on either side. And then I'll be back. I'll be using a neutral pH adhesive for this, but you can use any type of glue. This is just a bit more archival. You can use a brush or your finger for this. I'm gonna probably just use a brush. And you coat the back of each strip thoroughly. and make sure you get all the way to the end. There's no way to do this and not get messy, but just embrace it. And then pull it over and tape it down. And this is your last opportunity to make this binding as taut as you can make it. So it's good to pull these strips, especially when you do the other side. For the second side, I'm putting it on some non-stick baking paper. I usually use wax paper, but this is all I have today. And that's because this is still a little bit wet and I don't want it to stick to anything. And again, this is that last opportunity to really tighten this binding. Let's give a nice tug. And when you're finished with the tapes, make sure that you put a little bit of glue where those knots were. And I like to put a little bit on both sides, just for a little bit of added security. And then set that aside to dry, and then we'll be back in a few minutes to add the boards. Now it's dry and I'm ready to add the covers. So this will be my front cover and this will be my back cover. And I'm going to use a bit of this paper and put it under the first sheet just to protect the rest of the book from getting glue on it. So I'll put this sheet there. I'm not going to glue the paper, I'm going to actually glue the board and then stick it to the paper. And one way that I was taught to do the glue is to do it in a star formation. So you start from the center and then go out to the edge, and that way you make sure you cover everything equally. I don't know if this is the best way, but this is just the way that I've always done it. You continue in this spiral motion, moving the paint around in basically a circle. And it makes sure that you really don't miss any areas and that you're also getting all the way out to the edge. If these book covers were a slightly larger size than the signatures, I would be adding the glue to the first page of the signature and then the last page of the last signature instead. That's the traditional way to do it. But because these book covers are the same size as my book, it's just a little bit easier. And you definitely want to make sure you get all of the corners and all of the ends. Okay, so that looks pretty thoroughly covered. And now I want to line this sheet up with cover. And this can be a little bit tricky if it's the same size, which this is. And I also want to make sure that it's squared with the book. I don't want the cover to be topsy-turvy. So I'm going to line it up along the spine. And then again, I'll use a bone folder to secure that. And I don't feel any glue on this other side, but I'm going to add the paper anyway, just to be safe. And I'm going to add a bit of extra along. You see it's separating a bit here. Put a weight on it and then do the other side. And I'll add the second one. I'm going to clamp this really securely. And that should hold it. I'm just making especially sure that the clamp is along the spine where the book meets the paper, because I really want that to be a secure seal. And I'll set that aside to dry, and we'll be back when it's finished. This has had enough time to dry for a while, so now I want to decorate the front and back covers to make them look a little nicer. And for that, I'm going to use some eraser prints that I made about 100 years ago. And I keep them in here. And I think what I'm looking for is something that's going to just be a repetitive pattern, but be nice looking. And so maybe this one, I can alternate. That is a definite contender. Or this one could be a repeating one. That could be interesting. Or I have a few extra ones in here. These are some of my favorites. This one has one pattern on one side and the reverse pattern on the other side. So it's like a positive negative. And that's really a nice one in a pattern. And these are just borders, but I don't think I want those. And these two are quite fun also. So I'm just going to play with those a little bit and decide. So this is the stamp pad that I'll use. I want it just to be a nice brown color. And I have some paper. I don't even know if there's ink left in this one. Yeah, that's pretty good. So you can see if I put them side by side this way, I'm being crooked, but you get the idea. It creates a pattern. And then if I do the opposite side, it's a different pattern. So this could be a very strong maybe. These are more brittle and they haven't worn as well. These are made with the art gum erasers, whereas the other ones are made with vinyl erasers. And the fun thing about these is it's one thing on its own, but as you put them together, you have to line them up a bit. They start to create a pattern of their own. So there's a pattern within the pattern. I don't know if I like that one so much. And I don't know about this one either. I think it's a no for that. A no for this one. And the more you ink them, the more solid they get. So it's a little bit faint now, but the more I use it and the more coated with ink it gets, the stronger it will be. This one's fun because it creates a new shape. That's sort of interesting. I don't know though. I'm really loving this one still. Let's try this one. Oh, I have a positive negative on this too. So I could do them all together like that. I'm making a bit of a mess, but that's okay. I'm just playing here. I think if I put them together, I might like them more. Maybe not. I don't know. This is a maybe too. What do you think? Wish I could hear your answers. This is kind of interesting. I don't know. I like that more than I thought I would. I want to try this little baby. I have a little arrow on there to show where up is. So I think I did it diagonally like this. And then that helped me know how to place them. I mean, that's cute for sure. Oh, I like this one too. I think I need a new stamp pad. That could be fun, staggering it a bit. I don't know. I'm gonna have a think. Okay, I've had a bit of tea and a bit of a think, and I'm going to do this one for the front cover and this one for the back. So it's time to release it from its many clips. And I'm not going to open it just yet because I will have to set it aside to dry after I do the inking for a little bit, and I would like to give this a little bit more time, although it's pretty good. And I'll leave the paper on just to protect the pages underneath. Oh, I love that. I love the way the brown looks on the cardboard. I think every few rows I'm going to do the opposite side, just for a little bit of variety. I'm being a bit crooked on this, but I think that's okay. I want it to be a bit rustic. And I want some of these to be a little bit lighter than others, just to give it a bit more texture. I'll just run off the page with it. All right, that's the front cover, and now I'll do the back. That is a perfect fit, so that's great. I'm going to put some of these squigglies in the spaces in between. And that's the back. Now I'll set this aside again and allow it some time to dry, and then it's all finished. And here's the sketchbook all finished and decorated. You can see the nice tapes in the spine and the hard covers. And then it lays nice and flat so that when I want to paint, it's really easy to do so. I can just hold it in my hand, or I can lay it down. And then this sketchbook goes into this back pouch. And it's a perfect fit. I hope this video has been helpful and inspired you to make the perfect sketchbook of your own. I promise it will help encourage you to make more beautiful art. I hope you have a beautiful day and happy painting.